Welcome to Wellness Wednesday. My name is Keely Severson, and I'm here with co-hosts Eric Johnson and Alicia Swami. Together, we're exposing mold. In honor of Lyme Disease Awareness Month, we have Kris Newby on. Kris Newby is an award-winning science writer and the senior producer of the Lyme disease documentary Under Her Skin. She also wrote the book Bitten. Kris, thank you so much for joining us to talk about Lyme disease testing today.
Thanks for inviting me on for a second time. I really enjoyed the first time around.
Yeah, you're our favorite go-to Lyme person. You have such extensive research in Lyme disease between your book and your documentary. And Exposing Mold in April recently wrapped up a series on mold testing. And our overview conclusion was testing cannot validate the illness of the hypersensitivity because there's too many shortcomings in mold testing. And for that reason, there may be some cases where it's helpful or appropriate, but overall, it really can't find the hypersensitivity that mold sufferers endure. There's too many shortcomings. And so for Lyme Disease Awareness Month, I thought it would be a really great idea, or we did, to talk about the different tests for Lyme disease and the shortcomings and strengths of each, and see if there's any similar overlap in Lyme testing where sometimes it might not find the illness the way mold disease can't. So you were sharing with us the new CDC recommendations for Lyme disease testing. What are those, Kris?
Yeah, so the original testing criteria is a two-tiered testing system. So it's the first test is an ELISA or an IFA, and that's an immunofluorescent dye that highlights antibodies that your body produces against Lyme disease. The first step, the IFA or EIA, is not that specific. It's just a positive or a negative based on sort of the level of illumination of the organisms floating in your blood. But it is fundamentally an antibody test, and an antibody test isn't direct evidence of the Lyme disease bacterium. All it is your body producing antibodies for this disease? It could have been it could be that you don't have an active infection. Maybe you were exposed a couple months ago and your body's still reacting to it.
Are there any situations where the immune system is so suppressed that the body is not able to make the antibodies, so they wouldn't register in a test?
Yes. So a known phenomenon is, let's say you're fighting off multiple diseases like Lyme disease and babesiosis and some other tick-borne disease, maybe mold too. So your antibodies, you're not producing enough antibodies to be measured, or you get these like fur balls of antibodies, and then they don't react to the antigens that are presented because they're just all mixed up. So it's very common that doesn't work that well. And with Lyme disease, it doesn't work in the first month after an infection because your body hasn't had time to develop this antibody. So that's the first tier. The second tier traditionally was Western blot, and that is also an antibody test, but it gives you more information in that it breaks out specific antibodies that it sees in your body. And from those bands, you can tell, well, maybe you have a protein that's produced by the flagellum of the bacteria, or maybe you have a protein that is typical of neuroborreliosis, a brain infection, or arthritis. So it gives you more information. So that was the old test. CDC has moved to, they're saying you don't need to take the Western blot. It's just you do an ELISA and then you follow it up with another IFA or EIA or ELISA, another broad screening antibody test from a different manufacturer, FDA approved. So I think that's a disadvantage to a lot of the Lyme people because they'll lose that extra information of what stage of the disease they're in or where the infection is hanging out in their body. But I haven't had time to look at the data. So anyways, that's a big change. Also, that we're losing information in the testing. And then the other thing is, it's a good news, is they've added a different species that can cause Lyme disease. So it's a very close cousin to Borrelia burgdorferi. It's 93% of the genome is similar. And it's called Borrelia mayoni. And so they're saying, the CDC says, we can count cases of Borrelia mayoni as Lyme disease when we're doing surveillance. So that's the good news. The bad news is there aren't many tests available for mayoni. I think Mayo Clinic is the only one that can test for it. So I don't know. It's there's some good news and some bad news on the testing. But I have to say, the one really good news is the CDC now is being completely clear that this antibody testing is not to be used for denying treatment or diagnosis. It is just confirmatory, or it's like supporting evidence to the observations that the doctor might have and their diagnosis on what you have. So before, many doctors were using the CDC surveillance criteria, which is very strict, to try and figure out how the disease is spreading across the country, to say, well, you didn't meet the very high bar of the CDC testing criteria, so we're not going to treat you and count your case as positive. So now the CDC has put it on their pages. Yeah, this is for surveillance only.
I know that there are other companies that have options for mold testing. Are some of those a little bit more reliable, or do they have some of the same types of problems?
I don't know much about mold testing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to say Lyme testing.
Okay.
I mixed up my words.
Okay, ask it again.
Are there other Lyme tests other than what the CDC recommends that are more reliable, or reliable for different reasons, like the IGeneX testing?
Yes. So IGeneX, MDL, their tests are homegrown tests, so they're not FDA approved. It doesn't mean they're any less accurate than the FDA approved. What it means is, when you have an FDA approved test, you can market that test and sell it to other labs. IGeneX is a tick-borne specialty testing lab, and that's mostly what they do, and they're good at it, and they're just not marketing their test to other people, but it's still good. So right. So if you look at the big picture on Lyme disease testing, our screening tests for early disease, and I guess late disease too, is this antibody test. The antibody test doesn't work reliably in the first month, and many times it doesn't work late stage disease. And there's, well, I don't want to get too deep into that. So we do have new advanced testing, which is like PCR kind of testing for DNA and RNA. That's a little more expensive. Some labs do that. I think IGeneX does that. But a lot of care providers and insurance companies don't want to pay for that. I mean, if you have an EM rash or the classic symptoms, they'll just treat you presumptively. There are a bunch of really good tests in the pipeline now, and I'm hoping they reach people. So there are, I really like the multiplex tests. They're widely available in Europe. There's some obstacles to getting them in the US. So what a multiplex test is, you have a 96 well tray or a certain number of wells, and you have the antigens for multiple tick-borne diseases. So, you might have some other viruses, other bacteria, and Lyme disease. So you wash the blood, the serum over that. And then you can tell if you have multiple tick-borne diseases in one test. I mean, I think that's the future, because Lyme disease isn't the only bad hombre in ticks. There's super deadly recombinant spotted fever. You'll be in a coma in 14 days. There's the Powassan virus, where there's 1 out of 5 people die when they get the Powassan virus. So if you come in really, really sick, it would be so nice to have a fast test that tests for all those. So that's coming down the pipe. Now, the problem in the US is that we have an insurance system where they want to charge you 1 test for 1 disease, and they can't make as much money if it's all in one. So I'm not sure of the process of getting that through. Okay, so other things that are further down the pipeline that I think are promising, because I just recently went through all the NIH-funded diagnosis grants. So there's testing your microbiome. So with a stool test, you could run that through and see proteins you have in your stool, and if it reflects a pattern that is similar with someone who has, for example, chronic Lyme. So there's one company working on that. There's Right Eye is an ocular company, and so they've developed a test that is really effective at scanning your eyes for micro movements to tell if you've had brain injury. So that's like a concussion or Parkinson's. They've had a lot of success with those. So they said, well, why not chronic Lyme? Because there are definitely many ocular manifestations with chronic Lyme. So that's coming down. There are more blood tests, cytokine patterns. So what are cytokines? That's inflammatory markers that probably the mold people are familiar with when your body's, the inflammation that shows up as cytokines. So they're using AI to find patterns in cytokines that might tell the difference between long COVID, long Lyme, or mold infectivity. So I think that's super promising. And then there's general AI programs. So you put in, a doctor or you would put in your symptom sets, and it would list a couple probable diseases based on just your symptoms. So that's what's coming down the pipeline. I don't know when it'll be out.
Thank you for explaining that to us, Kris. I'd like to just ask Eric and Alicia if they have any questions for you.
Yeah, the Australians are working on an ocular test for myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome, where they're studying whether subtle movements can be used as a marker for what they're calling MECFS, and yet they're not doing a comparison between Lyme disease and the virally induced myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome. So I was afraid that it's very possible that they might detect something and start redefining MECFS as Lyme disease, unaware that they've made the substitution.
That's a problem with the silos, the medical silos, that they're not talking to each other. So I know I had tests when I was ill with contrast sensitivity, where you have trouble like seeing edges of things. And I know that's a common test for actually sort of those algae toxins when you have algae blooms. And Richie Schumacher sort of pioneered the use of contrast sensitivities. So that could apply to MECFS too, I think.
Yeah, and Dr. Shoemaker did make it clear in his books that that applies to chemical exposure as well as mold.
Mm-hmm.
So really a positive test is just a foot in the door to find out then which it is.
Right. But at least we get out of the, oh, it's all in your head diagnosis.
One thing I'd like to get clear to the Lyme community is that when Dr. Gary Holmes was investigating the Lake Tahoe mystery illness in 1985, he was looking for signs of an aberrant EBV strain, like a mutant that was acting in a new way. That's all he was looking at. So he announced to the newspapers, well, this isn't panning out. The EBV is not the cause. So therefore, there are no clues. And to my amazement, the entire medical profession took one look at that and said, well, that's it then. There's no clues. The Center for Disease Control officially said there are no clues. Well, at the same exact time, a housewife in Incline Village, Bonnie Bennett, had noticed her husband and some people in their condominium complex were developing what appeared to be like multiple sclerosis. She contacted Willie Burgdorferi, and through his testing, they unveiled an outbreak of borreliosis at Lake Tahoe at the exact same time as the CDC investigation that resulted in chronic fatigue syndrome. And what they found was that it wasn't burgdorferi, it was Borrelia hermsii, a relapsing fever. But this was found, it was, tested. They knew about it. It was reported to the Washoe County Department of Public Health, who admitted it, so there's no question. But they didn't tell the CDC about it. And even though Bonnie Bennett, in her book, she describes tick bites and multiple sclerosis, great book, how she contacted all the officials involved, all the CFS researchers, Dr. Cheney, Dr. Komaroff, told them about this. They ignored it completely. The chronic fatigue syndrome researchers said, well, we've done the Western blot. You are negative for Lyme disease, so that's it. And, I put my trust in these people, and I thought, well, they're the experts. I'll let them handle it. But here's the intriguing thing, is when I go to symposiums and I explain, well, there actually was an outbreak of borreliosis at Tahoe at the exact same time, and your PCR is not going to pick it up. Your Western blot's not going to detect Borrelia hermsii because your tests aren't contrived for that particular variant. And they admit that their testing is no good for it. But it's the sociological thing that intrigues me, is that they go, well, that's all in the past. That doesn't matter anymore. So all it took for the CDC to derail the investigation into chronic fatigue syndrome was to announce that there were no clues. And this was like sending a message to the world. There was nothing to follow up on because no researcher ever did. So here it is, like MECFS Awareness Day and Lyme Awareness Month. And we are seeing a complete blockade of awareness of people who are being made aware of clues, of information, of evidence, and act like they've never seen it.
Well, and then this year, the beginning of this year, there's information saying that MS is caused by EBV. So it's like deja vu.
It really is. And we saw in the Tahoe outbreak this attachment to EBV, reactivated EBV, as the cause. In fact, that's why the Center for Disease Control showed up in the first place, is chronic active EBV is known to result in strange cancers. But this shouldn't happen in normal, healthy controls. Normal adults should be able to keep EBV in restraint. So that's what brought them out. And that's primarily what they wanted to find out. Why is there a chronic state of active EBV? And here, in another similar appearing thing, the multiple sclerosis with chronic active EBV, rather than ask, why is EBV inexplicably reactivated? Why is the immune system failing to control this formerly trivial kissing disease? Now they're blaming the EBV as if it's the causative pathogen. So like you say, deja vu all over again.
Yeah, and I question the causality because it just, with the people I hang out, we're thinking that you have to have a bad actor infectious disease. Or we think that there is a bad actor infectious disease that is reactivating the latent viruses. And so it's the way a lot of the researchers are focused on Koch's postulate, one disease, one set of symptoms, instead of looking at the complexities of mixing Lyme disease and mold and EBV and all that. So I don't know how to get beyond that.
Yeah, in addition to Koch's postulates of testing one particular agent and see if the effect is reproducible, there's another way of looking at science, which is start with an observation. If something doesn't make sense, you look at it and you keep at it and you don't give up until it does start to make sense. Now, in the case of chronic fatigue syndrome, we've got groups of sick teachers in what were known to be sick buildings, and we didn't know what was in there. At the time, toxic mold was completely unknown. It was not in the literature yet, but all it would take for researchers to go, let's keep on this, let's stick with whatever is in those buildings until we find out what it is, regardless of Koch's postulates. And the first observation that I made in the Tahoe mystery illness was that there were people disenchanted with the viral explanation they were being given. Oh, you just have a reactivated EBV. You just have EBV for no reason. And they started to pull in other viruses like HHV6 or parvovirus or cytomegalovirus. Well, you just have EBV, or you have these viruses for no reason. And they got tired of that. And they started going to Lyme specialists. And there was one in Reno. So some of the members of the original cohort were going down to Reno and getting a Lyme diagnosis. Amazing, we've got two names for the same thing, chronic fatigue syndrome, Lyme disease, and neither side are trying to clarify which is the correct diagnosis. But thanks to this, I was able to watch these people with the Lyme diagnosis come back up to Lake Tahoe and go into these very sick buildings where the clusters had occurred. And much to my amazement, the Lyme disease people were the only discrete, identified, recognized illness who were just as reactive to the sick buildings as people with the Tahoe mystery illness were.
Yeah, and I think what we have is a paradigm issue where people who have mold and Lyme disease, you recognize the immune system as a continuum. There's like a water line, and you feel pretty healthy and you're above the water line, or you have like the weight of multiple conditions and exposures pushing you underwater and you're drowning. So I'll just share this personal story. I got a new primary care doctor here in Utah, and I had a bunch of what I would consider opportunistic minor infections that were piling on. And so I was telling him that. And then as part of that, I was telling him my medical history. Well, I have had Lyme disease, which I believe has sort of long-term effects on your immune system. And he goes, "What? Chronic Lyme is an imaginary disease. We don't even treat it here." And he goes, "Those aren't opportunistic infections. Everybody gets those, so this is what most people are up against, and they maybe aren't as feisty as I am." So we had a very heated discussion where I used bad words, and he goes, "There's no need for language like that." I mean, in a Mormon state. So anyways, this is the paradigm shift that we're up against with mold and tick-borne diseases and CFS.
Well, when logical discourse fails, what are you supposed to do except resort to stronger terms?
I know. So I did make him at the very end of the appointment. Okay, here's my elevator pitch for why chronic Lyme exists. But I'm sure I didn't change his mind.
Yeah, I'm afraid that maybe this is another thing we need to warn people about, is academics use a lot of tactics to keep other theories out of their way. And one of them is the academic collegiality tactic, where they deliberately escalate the tenor of the discourse until it becomes unacceptable and it's rude, and then call it off on grounds of no longer being a reasonable discussion. And they do this deliberately. So they just do this sea lioning, that asking stupid questions, holding you off, saying, well, your evidence is unproven. Cite your literature. Prove it to me. And they keep going on until you go, look, this observation has been repeated. We know about this. It's not a secret. As a researcher, it's your job to look into these abnormalities, these observations. And they go, well, now you're just getting angry. So they call it off deliberately. So you have to watch for this tactic. And at the signs where they begin to escalate the discussion deliberately so they can call it off and end in a stalemate, you've got to explain to them, we see what you're doing. You're just trying to bring this discussion to a stop. And we really want to bring this to a resolution.
I'm sure that, pardon me, I'm sure that you fired that doctor after that conversation. Someone doesn't believe in chronic Lyme. Goodbye, you're out of my book. But it's just so interesting because we've had so many discussions with other physicians, and they see, people with chronic Lyme, they see that they also have a mold issue. And it's just like this thought, this idea, this phenomenon that's happening that no one really knows why or what's going on, and so it's just really interesting to see that. And I hope one day, we will find someone who is interested, or there will be some funding where we can kind of figure out, what's going on here. Is it the mold causing the immune suppression that's prolonging the Lyme? What is it? So we have our own theories, but, it's just not a proven thing. So it's just really interesting what's going on here.
And long Lyme and mold is a thing. I had a friend on a support group for long COVID. I'm not long Lyme, long COVID. And the sickest person on the support group, she's so sick she can't even get up from the floor. So she holds her laptop on the floor like this. And the other day she had a seizure and her dog went crazy and they had to stop the support group. And last week she just announced that she realized she had mold in her house. So when they're looking into what makes some people get really bad long COVID, mold needs to be a differential.
We have been seeing that with long COVID, people reporting exposures to water damaged buildings. And there also does seem to be some overlap with people who have been injured by vaccines, the COVID vaccine. Some people that we have spoken with, well, actually all the people that I have spoken with that personally that have been injured have confirmed exposure to a moldy space. So this is just like, I guess, anecdotal observations from our telehealth consults. We're not saying this is like peer reviewed, but it doesn't matter. If you hear it enough times, like it should be on people's radar so that they're aware of the risks either way.
Yeah.
As different species of Borrelia were discovered, Grunii, Miyamotoi, Mayoni, were any comparisons made to see how their clinical presentation stacked up against the original burgdorferi?
You say, are there studies or?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like Mayoni has greater numbers of organisms, when it has an explosive growth phase. So it's more like a relapsing fever. It also, I just was writing about it. Let me pull this up. It can create nausea and vomiting and more widespread rashes. So it does have different symptom sets. And when I was researching for my book Bitten, I think that was the ending that I tried to make really emphatically is we have been wearing Lyme colored glasses, hyper focused on Lyme, and have been ignoring the co-infections, the viruses, and the other subspecies of Borrelia. One thing we know about Borrelia, it has the most chromosomes of any other bacteria, and it's very good at shape-shifting and mutating as it goes from, ticks to lizards to rodents to deer to people. So since it became a problem 50 years ago, is anybody really paying attention to the mutants? And that was the problem. If we back up to the beginning of this conversation, that's the problem with the widespread Lyme test used by Quest and LabCorp and things, it only measured the one strain from the Long Island, Lyme, Connecticut area. And it's ignoring the mutants like Mayoni and Miyamotoi that have emerged or been discovered since then. And it still causes serious disease. Someone once told me all Borrelias cause disease.
Well, when Borrelia was first detected, Polly Murray in Lyme, Connecticut, the illness was being confused with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. At least the doctors were diagnosing it that way. And yet when Bonnie Bennett detected this in Lake Tahoe with Borrelia hermsii, it was being mistaken for multiple sclerosis.
Mm-hmm.
So is that just a matter of doctors making a different diagnosis, or was there actually a different presentation between these two species?
Well, I think the Lyme world, it's too bad that the discoverer of Lyme disease, or the guy who first brought it to national attention, is Alan Steer, and he was a rheumatologist, and his mentor was too. So he looked at the disease through the eyes of a rheumatologist. It's a joint thing. And the joints were easy to see, the swelling, and people can point to the pain. It was a specific symptom. So the people I know feel like Alan Steer ignored the neurological symptoms and elevated the rheumatological. I think as I was reviewing the new CDC case definition, they did downplay the arthritic symptoms this time around, which I think is good, because anybody who's had Lyme knows the neurological symptoms are the most devastating, just like with long COVID, the brain fog, confusion, inability to multitask, executive functions.
I used to hang out with the loggers up in the mountains, watching them fall the trees and buck up the rounds and drag out the logs. And I remember one day we sat down for lunch and we're having a discussion. This was back in the 1960s, late 1960s, where they were talking about a Forest Service ranger who acquired a strange illness, which he swore was from a tick. And they called it the tick arthritis. Mm-hmm. And this guy, this Forest Service ranger, was disabled by it with a lot of pain. And as far as, I'd never met the guy, but the description sounded like he was just paralyzed by a full body pain. They didn't talk about neurological symptoms all that much, which was the reason for the arthritis description. But they were launching into a discussion of how dangerous this was, or whether it was dangerous, because they obviously didn't want to become paralyzed and lose their jobs, become completely disabled by a tick. So we sat around and discussed this for a while, and finally one guy stood up and said, well, you know, these Forest Service guys, they ride around in their trucks all day. How the hell did he get exposed to ticks? We're out here in the bush covered with ticks all day long. None of us are sick, so what's going on? So they decided that the guy's description did not fit the facts. It didn't make sense. And if anybody was going to be sick with the tick arthritis, they would, and they aren't. So they dismissed it.
What state was this in?
California, Sierra Nevada, Sonora Pass.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Under Our Skin, our main character was Jordan Fisher Smith, and he was a forest ranger. And he definitely got Lyme there.
Huh. So I've been watching this Lyme disease evolve in its presentation ever since, wondering, why does it look different in different places? And because of my observation with the people reacting to mold, I always wondered, I wonder how much of what Lyme disease is their reaction to mold.
Well, the different subspecies do have different symptoms. Like there was a recent paper that said Borrelia burgdorferi in Europe has a different set of symptoms than Borrelia burgdorferi here. And I've had other researchers say, well, if you have the rashes, maybe in the joint stuff, maybe you don't have as bad neurological. That's just anecdotal, but keep in mind, it's got the most plasmids, which are these little chromosome rings that allow it to mutate really fast. Of any bacteria, it's got like 31, and then it's got more chromosomes. So it as a bacteria, it's very clever and lots of ways to avoid the immune system, but it multiplies and swaps genetic material. It divides like a traditional bacteria, so you have identical versions of it. And then it goes into like fur balls, and there's a transfer of genetic material with others of Borrelia burgdorferi. So that gives it more diversity, and it allows it to adapt to different environmental conditions faster than just bacteria that go like that.
I think it's interesting that it was either the Washington Post or the New York Times that came out with this article. Well, there was like a map that they had put up, and they had shaded it to different colors to show this state has more issue with ticks, and this state there's nothing. And I find that really interesting because, I mean, isn't Lyme just sort of a national thing? And are they downplaying the issues in certain states because doctors are either A, ignoring it, or B, are, making a misdiagnosis like MS?
Well, it's a chicken and egg situation. The CDC's surveillance has been really, really bad. And their criteria says there's a different set of criteria for high incidence states and low incidence states, not acknowledging that the disease is spreading so fast. The low incidence states might be high incidence states here, so that it's just so flawed. Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, because they listed California as like a low risk state, and Eric's talking about tick issues back in the day, and we're seeing articles saying ticks are now found on California beaches. So how is it not a problem?
And then the mainstream tests don't pick up the strains that are in California. That's what we're finding. And then there's an attitude in California that CDC needs these reports. We'll send them in. We'll send in our obligatory couple or whatever. But the last I counted, California, there was 147 cases in the whole state. And we know that's wrong. You look at the dog data, and it's so much bigger than that. So
I seem to recall
it's the attitude of the people collecting the cases, and the fact that we have a test geared for the New York, Connecticut strains.
At the time the CDC was saying there's no Lyme disease in California, I seem to recall an advocate going out on his front lawn in Aptos and just collecting ticks, testing them, and it was there.
Yeah, that's around where I lived.
Crazy.
Definitely a lot of Lyme there.
Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. If you guys have any last questions or anything, I did want to post a comment from some of our peeps here that joined. But Eric, did you have any last things to say?
Oh, no, I think I've ranted enough.
All right.
Yeah, Alicia, pull this comment up. I don't even, Eric were laughing about this. I honestly don't even know what this means, but like maybe someone can enlighten me.
So this Chris Jacks, we love his comments. They're always so controversial. So thank you for always giving us your opinions, Chris. Lyme's another toxic metal symptom adaptation or co-infection. You're not going to kill it. You have to detox it with copper. Have you heard anything of that measure, Chris, in your experience?
Well, I thought copper was toxic. There are other ways of detoxing that I know people have had a lot of success with, like this vitamin C drips. And if you have heavy metal toxicity, Lyme disease is going to be worse. I know that for sure.
Well, the Open Medicine Foundation looked into heavy metal toxicity and said they're not seeing it. They're testing it with the most sophisticated methods that we know of and claim that they see no correlation. So there you go.
So I have a question for you guys, the mold babes. I get a lot of questions on like, what's the best way to test for mold in my house. So what is your go-to recommendation so I can share that?
We actually, I just finished up some content for our group, and we will be posting that. We're doing a wrap up of our mold testing series for the month. If you guys go to our podcast, the last 4 or 5 episodes have been specifically about mold testing. And so we've had some amazing people on. They definitely would want to check them out. But again, I also have some content coming out that really breaks down what is mold testing, what do these inspectors do, what is a sampling method, what are the different types, and things to watch out for, shortcomings in testing. So I will go ahead and post that on our page by tomorrow. So I can send that over to you, Kris, and you can share that with your group.
Oh,
we also have a consult service that we offer where we help walk people through understanding this at wherever they are in the process.
great.
So if that's a helpful resource for people that you work with, of course, we would love the referral. But to summarize, our general position as an organization is that mold testing is falling short. There's a type of hypersensitivity that mold testing cannot find, and there is types of injury that, like a mycotoxin screen or an air test in your home, just cannot validate. The best of the best inspectors that we've had on are people who understand mold is rarely in a visible location. It can be out of sight and still make you sick. And you do not have to find it on a test to be dying from it. Like, we've had inspectors on. One of them was Brian Carr from We Inspect. What was really interesting about his interview is that he did a series of samples where he would peg a wall. Like, the child in this bedroom is really sick. The exterior may or may not have warning signs. I'm going to test this wall. I think I'm going to find something in this wall, and then find Stachybotrys in the wall, and then test at like mouth level, like 8 inches away from that wall, and the test will be negative. So it's literally like, if you don't find the exact source and sample it, you could have been a centimeter away from a Stachybotrys colony, and it's just reading as another mold. And so our biggest thing with mold testing, and Michael Rubino, owner of All American Restoration, we had him on for our mold testing month, and we were so thankful that he emphasized this on our behalf to communicate to patients, sick people. A hypersensitive person knows more about mold in their environment than any mold test that exists. And then Dr. Chin Yang, he was telling us that the ERMI is completely outdated. We have to do like a part 2 to find out why. That there's species of Stachybotrys that haven't even been identified yet. So they're, so it's a complex issue, which is, why we wanted to have you on for Lyme disease testing, because I feel like there's this unanswered question of like, are all mold hypersensitives? Like, do we also have Lyme? I've never tested for Lyme, but I grew up in Wisconsin up north. Like, I was covered in ticks as a kid. I don't even know how many I pulled off. Like, the chances are pretty high, and so could I take every Lyme test under the sun and still not like find my species, or could they possibly all be negative? Like, these are things that can happen to the mold population. They can know they had a water damage event. They can get 2-3 inspectors in. They can take all this sampling and they can still be cleared like they're fine, even when they're not. And so this is kind of like the overarching message that we try to share with hypersensitivity and mold testing, because we don't want people who are super sick to think that they're fine because they got a false sense of security from a mold test. And so that's the complexity.
We see that with Lyme too. And the deeper I get into this, I realize there isn't one golden standard test that'll work. It has to be mostly like how the patient feels, their symptoms. You have to go on that. And the tests, you need multiple tests for different phases of the disease. And it's the whole picture of the patient. And the tests are just confirmatory, but you can't 100% trust them.
Yeah, we find that our patient population feels overly dependent on testing to verify to themselves that's why they're sick and it's, not a different disease name, or to verify for their family. And so we recognize, because it's not I guess, widely accepted or really well understood, that people feel the need for this validation. But our concern is for the people who this works against. When they're fighting with their husband and their kids are all super sick and they can't find the source, and the mold inspectors that visually inspected or air tested didn't find the source, then they basically have evidence that it's crazy and that you're crazy and it's in your head. And if you keep pushing the issue, like, are you going to end up divorced because your husband just couldn't wrap his head around it? I mean, this is the reality of the people's lives that we talk to on a daily basis. So something that we try to educate on a lot.
Wow, I hear you. I mean, I think that happens so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Kris. It was great having you on for Lyme Disease Awareness Month, and we look forward to having you on again in the future.
Well, thanks for the invite. I appreciate sharing.
It's always nice to have you on. Thank you so much.
Thanks.